Hey guys, it's Eamon. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the game Bobby Fischer versus Mikhail Tal. This was the fourth game they played in the 1959 Candidates Tournament, and at this point they'd played three times before, and Tal had won all three previous games against Fischer in the tournament. At this point, Fischer was 15, so he's just coming onto the international chess scene, and Tal was at the height of his powers. He would go on to win this candidates tournament and then challenge Botvinnik in the World Championship match the next year. Let's take a look. Fischer opens with e4, best by test. Tal plays the Sicilian, and we get a open Sicilian, knight f6, knight c3, and a6. So the Najdorf, one of the sharpest variations of the Sicilian. And now Fischer plays his favorite move, bishop c4. Which would later go on to be named after him, the Fischer-Sozin attack. And it's an aggressive positional move. White seeks to conquer this d5 square, but it also could be risky because it could run into a timely b5. So e6 seeks to control this d5 square, bishop b3, and b5. So Tal neglects development to expand on the queen side. And now f4, so an aggressive f-pawn push. And now Tal goes for a pretty outrageous plan. He plays b4, kicks the knight, and then takes this pawn in the center. And Fischer couldn't believe it when Tal took this pawn. It's an incredibly risky decision when he has no other pieces developed on the back rank. So Fischer castles and g6. So Tal's trying to prevent f5, or at least soften the blow of f5. And f5 comes anyways. So Tal takes once. Now knight takes f5, crashing through the center of the board. This pawn can't be taken because of a nice tactic. Queen d5 hits the rook. The rook only has one move, rook up to a7, and now the queen nudges back to d4, and that is a double attack on both rooks. So white would win material here. So the knight is untouchable. So instead, Tal plays rook g8. And Fischer says here that woozy, Tal stumbles into a dubious defense. But it's not quite over. Tal is still all right here. After bishop d5, this is a double attack, but this piece shouldn't be taken because after takes, then queen takes d5 would again fork these two pieces. So instead, the rook nudges up to a7, Fischer takes the knight, and Tal takes the knight on f5. So Black's king is still going to be forever stuck in the center, and he completely lacks development. And so here Fischer took the pawn. In his book, My 60 Memorable Games, he suggested either bishop f3 or bishop d5 would be slightly stronger. But bishop takes f5 also looks pretty reasonable. Now Tal plays rook e7, which is a unique way of shielding the king on the e file. Now Fischer exchanges and plays bishop f4. So looks like quite a natural developing move. In his book, he says that actually c3 would be stronger, just trying to opening up the c file. But bishop f4 also looks quite natural. However, after queen c6, black is definitely fighting back. He threatens mate and also threatens the knight. So queen f3 blocks that threat. And now another absolutely outrageous decision from Tal. He took the knight on a4. And again, Fischer was shell-shocked. He could not believe that Tal would grab that knight. Especially because Tal could have gone in for a nearly equal endgame. He could have traded queens and then played rook e2. And after rook f2, exchange rooks. And now we're in an equal material endgame. And white is still better, of course, because he has a much better pawn structure. all of black's pawns look pretty ragged, but at least material is equal and black would only be slightly worse here. But instead of going for the safe option, Tal takes the plunge. He takes the knight on a4. Now bishop takes d6. This rook definitely can't move because it can't move away from the a file and it has to defend f7. So Tal's defensive idea was to play queen back to c6. And now Fischer takes the hanging knight on b8. And again, Tal could have exchanged queens here and gone in for only a slightly worse endgame. But he was pretty intent on hanging on to his extra piece, and he played queen b6. King slides in the corner, and queen takes b8. So Tal is up a piece, but all of Fischer's pieces are looking quite strong, ready to jump into the game. And it was at this moment that a famous psychological duel occurred between the players. And this is a quote from Mikhail Tal's book. It is famous because it was here that a widely known psychological duel took place between us. Every player has his own habit. One will first make his move and then write it down, while another will do things the other way around. Incidentally, in recent years, Fischer has actively objected to this other way round, expressing the opinion that a score sheet is not a blackboard for writing down exercises. However, in our game, Fischer first wrote down the move Rook AE1, without doubt the strongest, and wrote it not in his usual English notation, but in European, almost Russian. Then he not very deftly pushed the score sheet towards me. He's asking for my endorsement, I thought to myself. And how was I to react? To frown was impossible. If I smiled, he would suspect trickery, and so I did the natural thing. I got up and began to calmly walk up and down the stage. I met Petrosian, made some joke to him, and he replied. The 15-year-old Fischer, who was essentially still only a large child, sat with a confused expression on his face, looking first at the front row of spectators, where his second was sitting, and then at me. Then he wrote down another move, Queen c6 check. So I really love that anecdote. It shows that even the great Bobby Fischer at some point had to go through the growing pains that all young chess players experience. And it's also quite hilarious to imagine him using such a trick to try to figure out the best move. So indeed, Rook e1 would have been the strongest move, and it looks absolutely terrifying for black with his king stuck in the center. In fact, he can still survive with king d8, and after a series of forcing moves here, takes, queen d5 check, king c7, the king gets checked around, and white can pick up this pawn. But here, after rook e8, black is actually surviving. Incredibly, there's no way for white to get at this open king here. And even white could be in trouble here if he lets black take over the initiative. However, this was still definitely the best way to play, and white wouldn't be any worse here. Instead of rook e1, Fischer played queen c6 check. And this also looks quite strong, but here with a series of only moves, Tal can survive. So first rook d7, now rook e1 check, bishop e7, and now rook takes f7. And it looks like this is going to be devastating for black. But actually, through his very precise calculation, Tal has figured out that he's actually okay here. So takes queen e6 check. Now, not king e8 because the rook is hanging. So instead, the king would have to drop back to f8. Queen takes, and now queen d6. And we can see Fischer's pieces are being pushed back here. He hasn't quite got through to the black king. Queen comes over to b7. Now a very important move, rook g6. And now black is definitely untangling. This is a really important move because it allows the king to slide over and hide behind the cover of the rook. The rook can block checks this way. So after rook g6, c3. So Fischer now realizes he could be in some trouble and decides to try to exchange pawns. a5, queen c8. So now we can see the king is reaching some safety over on g7. Queen comes back. Tal just rearranging his pieces. Pawns are exchanged. And now g3. And this move, Fischer was extremely critical of himself in his book for this move because it really simplifies the position for black and means that he can exchange queens with queen c6 check. Incidentally, g3 is actually the top engine move, but from a human perspective, it's not that natural. He could have tried queen e4 instead, and here after bishop c7, check, king coming back, some more checks, and then queen back to e4. Fischer thinks that black should hold this position. Sorry, white should hold this position. But there's still a lot of play left, and black would definitely have some winning chances here. Instead, after g3, Tal was able to exchange the queens and play without any risk from here on out. So the queens are exchanged, and rook b6. This is a really important way to defend the pawn. If, for example, bishop e7, this would actually be a big mistake because now white can play a3 and trade off those pawns. And here, once the pawns come off, even though black wins a pawn, the best white is going to be able to achieve here is rook and bishop versus rook, which should be a theoretical draw. Importantly, notice that this pawn is the wrong color, so that it's going to be difficult to queen that pawn when the corner square is a light square. So rook b6 was definitely the most accurate way to defend that pawn. And now if a3 was played, you could simply play b3 and keep that pawn alive. So king g2, Tal brings up his king, and it's quite nice for Tal that his king is already getting active. His king has already made it to the center before white's king. Check, and the king gets forced back. Tal just rearranging his pieces here, trying to find the best setup. The rook is now passive, tied down to the defense of this b2 pawn. And now black's rook comes in, comes back. So Tal just shuffling around, trying to find the best way to attack. And now this move a3. And of course, Fischer, again, would love it if these pawns would get exchanged, but Tal isn't going to do that. He's already ready to play b3. And now this b2 pawn is a big weakness. Tal just has to be careful that he doesn't ever lose this b3 pawn because then his winning chances would evaporate. Bishop takes, check, king c6. The rook tries to come behind the pawn, but rook f3. And the rook defends the pawn. Now an important move. Rook c3 check. Again, important not to take this pawn immediately because then the rooks would be then the b pawn would be exchanged. So that's why rook c3 check first forces the king in front of the pawn. King comes back to c7, hits the rook. And finally, one more finishing touch, bishop a1, clearing the way for the pawn to advance to b2. Now there's there's no defense, no way to stop that pawn because after a4 and b2, Fischer resigned the game because there's no way to stop this b pawn from getting home. If the rook is taken, then black queens would check. Otherwise, if the king steps out of the way, then simply rook c1, and there's going to be a new queen. All right, and so in this position, after b2, Fischer resigned the game and lost 4 games in a row to Tal in that candidates tournament. So, really interesting psychological duel back in this position after queen b8, when Fischer knew the best move was rook a1, but he psyched himself out. He fell for Tal's trick of a bit of acting. Right. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed, please hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos in the future. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one.